Hello and welcome to Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. I'm Ken Coughlin, and you are?
Ryan McAllister,
and
in the house.
In the house. As a matter of fact, we were just talking before we went on there, because, you know, Mary Kay always announces, I'm playing the intro music, and you were talking about the awesome intro music. This is one of the ones you wrote?
Which one is it?
Trinity Talk Live. This is not one of the one you wrote, but this is the one you performed. This is the opening riff from, what's the song? Love the Lord your God.
I didn't know it was going to be named that tune.
So you didn't write this one, but you did perform this one.
Performed. Yeah.
So there you go. Ryan is our he's a musician extraordinaire. You wrote, I remember you wrote the theme song for a lot of the stuff we've had on the channel over the years. You wrote it for Jake and Gracie, was your handiwork. Yep. And I think the original, that's why I was getting confused, because we used to have a different theme music for this show back under its old format, and you wrote the theme song for that, as I recall. So anyway, hey, welcome. Thank you for joining us here today on Wednesday evening at 5:30. This is your first time watching, welcome. Trinity Talk Live, our byline says it all, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. Our goal here in this show is we try to talk about whatever the topics are that people out there in the world are talking about. But what makes this program unique is we try to bring a uniquely Christian perspective to it. I often say there's no shortage of resources, websites you can go to find out what every single person thinks about every single thing going on in the world. Just go to social media. But sometimes it's hard to see a particularly Christian perspective on it. Now, does that mean that we're always going to have it right? No, of course not. But it does mean what we try to do on this show is at least, take into consideration, Christian principles when we are thinking about how we should think about and how we should respond to these things that people are talking about. So before we launch into it, I want to say a couple things. Number one, the show is meant to be interactive. So we are live right now on the Trinity Joppa Facebook page and the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel. You are free, if you're watching us live, to please comment on either one of those. If you have a comment on something we say, you have a question about something you want to hear our answer to, if you comment in the YouTube live chat or on the Facebook live page, I will see it right here on my handy dandy computer. Handy dandy. See, I was just talking to someone how our new, Jess's new program, Kids Zone, Fruits of the Spirit, it's like the Christian version of Blue's Clues. So I got Blue's Clues on the brain. You ever watch the handy dandy notebook, right?
That's old school.
So this is my handy dandy computer. It's the modern version of Blue's Clues. If Blue's Clues were made today, he'd have a handy dandy computer. But anyway.
It's missing its green stripes. Just saying.
That's true. Anyway, but I will see your comment here, and if I miss it, my lovely producer, Mary Kay, back there will hold up some signs to make sure I know the comments have been made. And as soon as we have a stopping point in the conversation, I will insert your comment here, and we will respond to you, answer any questions, what have you, live on the air. So please join in the conversation, submit your question or comment in the live chat or the comment section on Facebook. One other warning I want to give, and I'm not anticipating a problem, but tonight for our school here, Trinity Lutheran Christian School, is back to school night. And obviously in the era of COVID, it is a virtual back to school night. And most of the teachers, some of the teachers are doing like live Zoom meetings, but most of the teachers actually, we produced these videos, a video back to school night that's airing on the channel. Now, there are 8 different videos for different grade levels, etc., that are set to premiere at 6 o'clock tonight. Now, this is the first, I don't believe, and I Googled everything to try to find out, I do not believe that holding a live stream will interfere in any way, shape, or form with a video premiering, because a video premiering on YouTube is just like uploading a video and now it's available. But if you ever see me when we get closer to 6 o'clock, start looking at my phone, that's why, because I do want to make sure that we're not interfering in any way, shape, or form with those premieres and they go off without a hitch. If for some reason I find things are going wrong, then we will sign off very, very quickly, because I don't want to interfere with that. And wherever we're at, we'll just pick it up next week when Ryan's not around. So that's why you chose the second sex talk one to cover.
There you go.
Because you're figuring if we have to sign off, you won't have to do it.
There you go. You found me out, Ken.
Yeah, the everybody watches like, what?
Yeah.
So-
Get ready for it.
Well, one thing on the show we don't do is we don't shy away from controversial or uncomfortable issues, and we're going to have some doozies tonight. So anyway, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to launch into our first topic of the night. I will introduce this one. This is our first of 2 sex talks for the night. This one actually comes out of California, and there's a lot of confusion about this. And so I want to make sure that we're reporting it accurately before we comment on it. California, both houses of their legislature has just passed a bill. It's Senate Bill 145, all right? Now, a little background for this bill, because again, there's some misinformation out there about it. It is illegal in California for any adult to have sexual relations with well, first of all, anybody under 14, we're not even talking about that. It's a felony. You're on the sex offender registry, period. But what we're talking about are people between the ages of 14 and 17, because the legal age of consent in California is 18 years old. And so the question is, well, what is the law in California in regard to sexual intercourse with someone who's between the ages of 14 and 17? Well, we'll try to be as delicate as possible about it, but obviously there's different types of sex acts that can be performed. And the full-fledged intercourse, the way that the law is phrased in California is, first of all, it is a felony, it is a crime, but the question then arises, in addition to just being a crime, are you going to be automatically placed on the sex offender registry? And that's what this bill concerns. The law has been that if it's intercourse, then you don't necessarily automatically have to be placed upon the sex offender registry. The judge can, in his or her discretion, still put you on it, but they don't have to put you on the sex offender registry. However, if it's any of a number of other, sex acts, whether it be, oral sex or things like that, then the law in California is not only is it still a crime, but you do automatically get put on the sex offender registry. So, what this Senate bill has proposed doing, and it's passed both houses, just waiting for the governor's signature now, is it's saying even if it's eliminating the automatic registry for across the board, no matter what the act is. And so no matter what the sex act is, if it's with a minor between ages of 14 and 17, the judge can still put you on the registry, but there is no longer an automatic putting you on the sex offender registry, as long as there's there's no more than 10 years age difference between the parties. So if there is more, this doesn't change anything. If it's a 30-year-old and a 14-year-old, it doesn't change anything. If it's a 24-year-old and a 14-year-old, it does. But it only regard to whether or not they're going to be put on that sex offender registry. Now, like I said, it's passed both houses, and the rationale for it that's been put forward is that the law as it currently exists is discriminatory against the LGBTQ community because obviously they're not engaging in ordinary biological intercourse, all right? And so the acts that they're engaging in automatically put them on the registry, whereas, heterosexual sexual intercourse does not automatically put them on the registry. And so it's being presented as, an equalizer. We're just removing that. I'll let you share your thoughts first, because I'm just going to hint here. I can see other ways of equalizing things without this, but I'll save that. Go ahead, Ryan. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, wow, we're starting off with a big one here.
We are.
Yeah. I don't want to steal your thunder, but my immediate reaction is, first of all, we're moving in a direction, and this is the direction that California is wanting to move in. But I'm wondering why we're not moving in the other direction, meaning let's make it mandatory that if anyone who is convicted of a felony, sexual act with a minor of any type has to automatically be on the sex offender list. So I think we're on the same page. Just immediately going with that. That's an easy way then to make it where you're not discriminating against anyone, and you're not lessening. I just don't understand, politically, how this wasn't going to be brought in this light from at least some groups in the country. Do you agree?
Yeah, and if you look historically, all right, there's a history of laws in our country, sodomy laws, for example, that for the longest time actually forbid certain acts. And so that's what a lot of the conversation has been about, is that this is kind of some people would say a relic, but it's a leftover from that era where it's signaling out these particular sex acts as being something different than just normal intercourse. And so that's why I guess this law came about in the first place. But my reaction, I think it was the same as yours. Well, wait a minute. We can you want to talk about equality, and even forgetting LGBTQ community for a moment, just, talking about equality across sex acts. If we want to say that, okay, these particular sex acts aren't worse than these particular sex acts when it comes to being done with a minor, I can be on board with that. I can get that. Yeah, you shouldn't be doing anything to a minor. But we can still have equality, whether it be across the acts or across the communities, what have you, by just saying, okay, you do this with a minor who legally can't consent, you're on the sex offender registry, and accomplishes the same goal. And so when I hear this pitched as just being about equality, it's like my eyebrow kind of raises, because just because you want things to be equal doesn't mean this is a conclusion you had to come to.
Yeah, I agree, Ken. One question I wrote down is, well, what's the purpose of having the laws in the first place, of having a statutory rape law? Because that's what they're talking about here,
right.
And that's brought up in this article at least. Is the purpose really to distinguish between all of these acts, or is it to protect those who are between 14 and 17 who are not able to consent legally to these relationships, these acts? I have to think, even if they're antiquated, that still holds water today. That's the purpose, and that's the argument that you would make, is to protect these kids. And there's a great quote. I think I can throw this in there from. It says Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez from California, and she said, "I cannot, in my mind as a mother, understand how sex between a 24-year-old and a 14-year-old could ever be consensual."
Right.
And now that's the extreme of the parameters that are given.
But it's still permitted under this law.
But it is. And so that's where people are going to go to, well, that's the extreme, let's talk about it. But that is true. So that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get into these semantic things, but even this one article that we're reading from right here says, under the current law, it is illegal for an adult to have consensual sex with a teenager between 14 and 17 years old. Well, no, it's the way the law says it. They can't consent, and so it's not consensual sex to begin with. There's no such thing, legally speaking, as consensual sex with a minor. And I guess here's what putting the Christian perspective hat on for a minute here. And I've often said this in the abortion debate, and I will repeat it here because it applies equally here. Is one obligation I think we as Christians should take very seriously, is the obligation to be the voice for those who don't have an adequate voice for themselves, to speak up for those who are the helpless, the most helpless, so to speak. And that clearly applies to children. And we should be at the forefront of trying to protect children. And so what I don't get about this law is, in the name of equality, it actually makes I don't know what the right word is I'm looking for, but it does less to protect children, as opposed to what you could have taken the opposite approach and say, we can still make things equal, but do more to protect children. Why, given the two options, would you take the one that protects children less?
Yeah, well, and Ken, and I agree, reading this too, I guess part of the argument from the other side I'm trying to look at is, well, the judge still has the ability and the flexibility to, at their discretion, decide, because being on the sex offender list is something that will carry with you for the rest of your life. And I think that that's true, that
right.
It would carry with you, but that's the purpose.
Right.
The purpose is so that you have to identify that you committed a felony.
Right. A serious felony. Yeah, and this particular type of felony. And I guess my... You mentioned that the judge has discretion, and I always like to fully admit my biases. I've been an attorney for over 2 decades. Now I'm just doing in-house stuff here for the church and school, but I was a litigator for basically about 20 years. I've been in front of many a judge, all right? I want to be fair, and please understand this is purely anecdotal. I acknowledge it. It's my personal experience. I don't have a lot of faith in consistency with judges' discretion in this type of situation. I mean, I've been in front of so many different judges. There was one in a jurisdiction I used to practice in a long time ago. I won't name him particularly, but there was a judge who used to be the lead prosecutor in this jurisdiction, and the running joke was even after he got on the bench, he thought he still was, and you could tell. It's like, because we all as attorneys, we know that if you go in front of one judge, you're getting this exact same case is going to get one outcome in front of one judge and another outcome in front of another judge. And so when I don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say judges shouldn't have any discretion. Of course they should, but on something like this, my fear is that you're going to have some situations where, people, the same basic case, some of them are going to be put on the registry and some aren't. And for something like a sex offender registry, I think consistency is more important than this. Now, where I will say that I could see, and this has been something I've been sympathetic towards for some time, is knowledge, and I know there's a lot of discussion about, well, what if the minor lied, had a false ID, who knows what length they went to. I'm sympathetic to that situation, possibly being a mitigating factor, but that would be a mitigating factor to, are you guilty of knowingly having intercourse with someone who's a minor? Right. But once you're found guilty, I don't really see why you wouldn't be on the sex offender registry.
Because, this is assuming that the person in question who has been convicted.
Convicted, right.
Correct.
Right.
Okay. And just, I don't want to skip to stealing any thunder from the last topic that we're going to talk about too, but just from the Christian perspective here, and this is opening a can of worms a little bit, but maybe we need to open it. There are easy fixes to this in like a moral Christian perspective. If we let's go to the 10 Commandments and we really hold true to, you should not have an intimate relationship with another person unless you're married.
Right.
I know there's sin in the world, but that's not what we're talking about. There's none of that in here at all. Mm-hmm. I've not seen that anywhere, that marriage is even on the table. Now, I'm not talking about marrying someone who is 14 or 15. I am not suggesting that in any way whatsoever. But as an adult, if you hold that I'm not going to have that relationship until I'm married, and I can't marry someone who's that age anyway, the logic plays out that you have to. Right.
Well, yeah, and I think you're hitting on something culturally that we're seeing that may be explaining, maybe this is the answer to that question about, well, why, in the name of equality, why do you go this direction instead of that direction? And it's because we're seeing culturally it's been going on for a long time now, the free love movement in the 1960s and everything like that, where, it's gotten to the point now where it's not just that, sex outside of marriage is no longer taboo. It's expected. I mean, and we'll maybe get to that when we get to the last. We'll talk about more of that in the last story. But you're seeing a cultural movement of permissibility of casual sex and casual relationships, and so as a result, that's kind of what now we're balancing. Which direction are we going to go in this law? And we go in the direction that's more in line with where the direction the culture is going, as opposed to protecting children. And it bugs me. It does bug me.
Yeah.
So,
Can I just add in 3 thoughts? First, not that I disagree with you, Brian, on the nobody should be thinking of marrying somebody between those ages. There are a lot of states where the age of consent for marriage is actually 14. So I mean, I don't think neither one of you looked up what the age of consent for marriage is in California, did you?
No.
Okay. So I'm not completely sure which ones, but I seem to remember finding out one of the states in our immediate vicinity, 14 is actually the age of consent in order to get married. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to throw that out. Second, there are also a lot of I forget how they refer to them, but caveats to laws like this to accommodate when you have a boyfriend and girlfriend who are having a sexual relationship and one of them happens to turn 18, and so therefore they're an adult, and one of them is an adult and the other one is maybe still a minor.
Well, let me stop you there for a second, because there's a difference between that and what we're talking about here. There are in many states grandfather clauses, if you want to call them that, that, for the offense itself, all right, whether or not you will be guilty of it can be determined by the close proximity in age. So like you have somebody that's 2 months apart or something like that, they're really close in age in that regard. Many states do have, kind of a neutral zone, if you want to go, but that still goes back to whether you're guilty of the offense. So the question here now is, you've been found guilty, are you going on the sex offender registry or not, which is a different question.
I have to say that I totally agree with you about, the first thing I said to Lisa before you opened it up for discussion between the two of you is, okay, if you want to equalize things, why didn't you go the other way, just like the rest of
exactly.
You guys were talking about. But another thing that interests me is, and I don't know if they mentioned it anywhere in the articles, why did they choose 10 years?
And that was huge. I agree.
Even if you go to 17, that's still 27.
Yeah.
It seems.
Did it say it anywhere in there?
It doesn't, that I could see.
No.
It seems an arbitrary number of let's choose this, and
a pretty big
a nice
number.
Round number. It's big.
Yeah.
It's big.
And even most of those grandfather clauses, wherever that I'm talking about, typically there's 3 years, 2 to 3 years time frame is what those allow for. 10 years, well, granted, it's not saying that a 24-year-old can be found not guilty of the offense for having intercourse with a 14-year-old. It is still a big number for not going on the sex offender registry. So anyway, I think we're all kind of in agreement on that one.
Yeah.
So let's get out of the frying pan into the fire, maybe, and go with our second story, Ryan. Why don't you? Controversy number 2. Go.
Controversy number 2. The NBA playoffs ratings are slipping, and there is some talk that the grumbling between fans, or among fans, is that the league has become too political. And for those of you who haven't watched any of the NBA playoffs, they're in a bubble, so they're contained. They don't have any fans there. And I have been watching some, to be honest, so that's something that really interested me in this. I'm not a huge NBA fan. I love basketball, particularly college basketball, but it's been fun to have some sports back on to watch a little bit. So I've watched a little bit of the NBA, and if you haven't seen, just some very obvious things, the jerseys where in the back on the top would be the player's name. Right now we'll have some kind of I think slogan's a fair word to use, maybe like Black Lives Matter, or the name of someone who is a victim of a shooting or something of that nature. And they do have their names down at the bottom underneath the number. And then there are large Black Lives Matter signs or other signs of that nature. And the coaches have badges that talk about equality and unity, and even during the commercials, there's a lot of commercials that will have a similar message. So I just have to say, from seeing it, I'm not saying I'm grumbling because of it, but it is very visible. So I think that that's accurate to see that there is a message being put out there by the NBA. And then the obvious example of them striking last week?
It was last week, yeah.
For 2 games, or 2 evenings worth of games, over the incident in Wisconsin.
Right.
Kenosha, right?
Kenosha, yeah.
Yeah.
Which we talked a little bit about last week. But
Okay.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question about that last one. And I should preface my comments by saying that, you know what, I'm a big believer in free speech. I've mentioned many times in the show before that I'm a big believer in the marketplace of ideas. I want ideas out there. I want open communication. And if their employer, the NBA in this case, or the individual team owners, whatever, want to do this, then, I'll defend their right to do it. Now, we'll get into the consequences in a moment here, I guess, of doing that. But I'll defend their right. If they want to send these messages, if they want to do this, I am not one that's going to say, that would try to silence them in any way, shape, or form. They should be entitled to do that. But before we get into kind of the consequences and the response, okay, so just because they have the right to do that, then what's the response to it? I got to admit that last one you mentioned puzzled me, the strike. All right. I get it with, you're putting the names on the jerseys, you're putting the signs, you're doing the commercials. Striking for 2 games. Normally, what is a strike used for? A strike in the labor force is used because you're trying to get some kind of concession out of your employer. All right. It's not a protest per se. And so I guess, and maybe somebody you want to comment can acquaint me and enlighten me on this one, because I'm just not seeing the logical connection of what was hoped to be accomplished by striking when your beef isn't with your employer here, it's with this culture and society.
Yeah. I don't know the answer other than, from seeing on sports and ESPN and other outlets like that, it's very visible, okay, they're protesting and they're striking, from these games for this reason. So we know that they're making a statement, and but part of the issue that I had with it, or that I couldn't quite connect the dots with completely, was, they talk about the platform that they have, and this does say something very clear, but part of the reason of having your jerseys with all of that on it, having the commercials, and having all of that all over the stadiums there, is so that when people watch your games, they will see it, and no one could watch your games. Now, maybe the argument is, well, those games are just going to be postponed, and we'll watch it later, and we want to take time to, out of respect and reverence, grieve what has happened and wrestle with that. So I can see that. I think where it comes for me is, I agree they have the right, and this is not a public organization. They're privately owned, and the players are privately contracted to, and they have a union, and they can do as they like. What I think is interesting is to say that they're not a political organization, but they're being organized politically. And that's just a distinction that kind of clicked in my mind, where, you're making political statements, you are. And I understand that, like in this article, it talks about Trump targeting the NBA and just criticizing their, deciding not to play, and that having an impact. And I understand, and I'm not defending him and what he said or did, but having a response that is a political one, I think you talked about consequences. They will have consequences. Yeah. And it seems to me that, in judging by some of the statistics there was a Harris poll that talked about the critiques and how that has impacted those who are watching the game. And, big surprise, those who are more on the Republican persuasion versus Democrat are swaying hard in either direction.
Right.
So that one thing that this worries me with is, okay, NBA, you're making a statement, but now the people who are watching and seeing your statement are not the people that you need to convince of any change, or that they're already aligned with your perspective.
Right.
Overwhelmingly, if these numbers are accurate. So you don't want to alienate them.
Right.
So it's a fine line, and I don't know what the answer is, but it's difficult.
Yeah, I guess here's where I don't know the answer. And you're right. That or that Harris poll rather, it talked about, what are the reasons if people are watching less, what are the reasons they're watching less of the NBA coverage? And then clearly the number one choice, 38%, and people could choose more than one, but 38% of respondents said the league was becoming too political as kind of like the primary reason why they're not watching as much anymore, beating out even by I think 10 percentage points. That it's boring without the fans was the next one. It's so people feel more strongly about the political messages that's being inculcating the games than they do about the fact that it's just not as intensive of an experience. And I guess here's where I come at. And like I said, I will defend their right to do what they want. I guess where I find it unfortunate, and I've talked in the show before about a lot of the racial issues, and people know how I stand about on those if you're a regular viewer of the program. And I do think we've got, as a country, have a long way to go as far as showing more empathy for people and trying to put ourselves in other people's shoes and see things from their perspective. I just think it's somewhat unfortunate, because what I think is lacking in our and I mean by unfortunate I mean what's going on with the NBA. What's lacking in our country right now are things to unify us. We are seeing so much division in our culture, and it used to be that sport, no matter how much we disagreed outside that sports arena, outside that stadium, it didn't matter what your political persuasion was. You put on the team jersey and you walk in and you can sit next to someone that you may walk out of that stadium and be diametrically opposed on every political issue out there. But while you're sitting in that stadium, you're on the same side and you've got a common goal. And that's what I always loved about sports. Now, I'm not a huge NBA fan. I am, first and foremost, I'm a football guy all the way, particularly college, then NFL, and then number 3 would probably be NCAA basketball. I love March Madness. But that's what I always loved about sport.
Yeah.
Sport is a way of unifying us in our divisions, and now we're seeing the divisions seep into that, and so we don't have that.
Yeah, and I agree, Ken. I think it's difficult. I've seen I enjoy watching sports a lot. Watch SportsCenter, and have seen a lot of the interviews from some of the NBA players and others. And there's a lot of language that talks about we don't want to go into sports and just kind of forget what's happening in the outside world. Like, we're ready to bring it in and to make it as visible as we can on our platform. So unfortunately, there is some division then, and we miss some of that camaraderie maybe of letting those boundaries down and simply just being in the sport. But that's a consequence. That's their choice, and I hope it doesn't continue and drive deeper divides in the country. I really hope it doesn't. And I don't think that that's their purpose.
No, I don't either. It's just, and I don't want to be misunderstood be saying that. I'm not saying, as a result of this, you shouldn't do this. Again, I will defend their right to do this. I'm looking right now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first grade back to school night premiering. Here, let me go my close up so you can see it. Premiering. This is the countdown. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go. We got to watch this cool intro I made. You're not going to be able to hear it, but there's music to it too. Here we go. Look at that. Look at that.
Whoa.
Isn't that cool?
Animation.
Isn't that awesome? That is awesome. But that also means that, Ryan, you're not off the hook. You're going to have to lead the discussion on the second sex talk. Sorry. Everything is going well. And look, there's Mr. Gast, our head of school. Hi, Mr. Gast. All right. So that's working well. Good. So yeah, I don't want to be misunderstood to be saying that I'm like, oh, you shouldn't be doing this because of this. If this is what you want to do, then you have the right to do it, and I will defend your right to do it. I just I find it unfortunate that we've lost that.
Yeah, I will just, one last thing is, with football season starting tomorrow, it will be interesting to see how this plays out in football. I don't think it's going to be on the scale of their uniforms being changed and other things like that. And I believe there will be some fans in the stands and other things of that nature. So it's not the same situation. But one part in this, and something else that I've read, talks about the demographic of those who watch professional basketball as opposed to those who watch professional football being different. And it'll be interesting to see how that's received if there are protests,
right?
If there, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm very curious to see. Yes.
And you know what? If something does happen, then Ben's back next week, so
Ben's
it's his
back,
problem to
so
talk
he
about
has
it,
to
right?
deal with it.
So one thing I can't stop thinking about is that, again, I understand the NBA, private, they can do what they want, but it makes me think of the Oscars and how what used to be one of the most watched nights on TV has also lost ratings because of what a lot of the winners were doing with their acceptance speeches were no longer really acceptance speeches as much as political statements. Right.
Well, you got to understand, when you do things like that, whether it be the NBA, whether it be Oscar speeches, and you allow things like that, then yeah, you're gonna anger a segment of your audience. You're gonna lose them.
Their purpose, there's going to be people who are trying to use the sports, or they're trying to use the Oscars as an escape sometimes from, what's happening in the world, just a break,
right,
from all that they're getting on the news and everything like that. And if they're not getting the break that they're seeking,
then they're not going to go there. And that's, and that's where it just falls to the people who run the Oscars. It falls to the NBA owners. They have the choice to make. If they, and I will defend either choice they want to make. If they think that they want to continue to allow this, understanding that you're going to lose a segment of your audience, then fine, that you can do that, but don't act surprised when you lose a segment of your audience. But if you don't, then that's fine too. That's your right, because it is a business after all.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, for a lot of these that we're talking about, the Oscars or sports, any political statement is going to have an impact.
Yeah.
So not just this, any political statement will, and that's happened in the past. It's not new. It's not, shouldn't catch us by surprise. But it's definitely taken to a new degree now, given everything, the movement that is happening.
Right.
For sure.
In case anybody's wondering, well, aren't you doing the same thing on this show? Well, our show says it's, Christian, from a Christian perspective right off the get-go. So we don't, this, it's a little different in an environment where that is the primary purpose. Like anything on our channel, our primary purpose, if you're watching the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel, you got to know you're going to see Christ lifted up. That's our stated goal. What we see is when you've got things like where the entertainment, where the stated goal is something different, and these types of things are slipping in. But hey, you know what? You raise a good point though, and we've got to be fair. How many times do you see people in acceptance speech, maybe not as much as you used to, in acceptance speech go up there and thank Jesus? It's and people on the opposite end would say, well, aren't you being a hypocrite? No, because I'm saying consistently, the people, if they want to do that, they can do that.
And they can. And when people do that, there are, a portion of our country or the world that will say, I'm not happy that they did that.
Right.
I don't agree with that. And we'll condemn them for that. And that's their opinion. And they can have it too. And because you could thank God, Jesus, you could thank your mom, you could thank Allah, you could,
right.
They can make that choice, and there will be consequences.
And we can comment, and Ben and I know have, about what it says about the direction of our culture and things based on what we observe people doing. But when you're asking the fundamental question, well, should they be allowed to do it? Yeah. I mean, if the owners or whatever are okay with it, then then they can do it. All right, let's move on to our third story, shall we? Now that we know that the back to school nights are going off without a hitch, our third story today comes from Francis Chan, actually. Most people will recognize the name. He's the founder of Cornerstone Church in Simi Valley, California. To show how out of touch I was, I didn't know that he's not even living in the United States anymore. Apparently he's living in Hong Kong, according to this article. I didn't know that. I think I knew he wasn't the pastor there anymore. I think I did remember hearing that, but I didn't know that he was living overseas now. But he was on speaking at something called a Q session, but basically he was talking about the pandemic, all right, and his opinions specifically about the church and the pandemic. I'm going to read a couple quotes of what he had to say. He said, "I love this season we're in, and I think every true believer does, because we look at kind of the status quo, and we're just hoping for a time when we're forced into action. It's almost like you're training for something, and here it is. Are we prepared or not?" And he also talked about how, a lot of the commentary, a lot of the news stories you'll see in the Christian media outlets here are, Christian churches, pastors here in America that are complaining about religious freedom issues. And maybe complaining is the wrong word to use, but you know what I mean. I'm not trying to diminish it, but they're basically raising religious freedom issues, and they're talking about how the restrictions that are being placed, that are COVID-related restrictions, are having what they believe to be a disproportionate impact upon the church. And in many situations, I agree with them. But what Francis Chan was addressing, he does start out by saying, I'm not saying don't fight for religious freedom. He's saying, yes, we should be fighting for religious freedom. But he says at the same time, I'm not really afraid of losing it, because I look at how the church is flourishing, and he's talking about in places where the church is being persecuted, how it's flourishing. And again, I'm not saying that I'm wanting or desiring the persecution, but what I am wanting is to see a pure church where people are devoted. They're serious and they understand what it means to really follow Jesus. Then we can really be a light to the world. And I think what his point here is that when you enjoy religious freedom, when things are comfortable, you almost become complacent. And are we seeing that this is almost a wake-up call, that the church got so used to its comfort zone that it wasn't flourishing. And, we can talk about all sorts of things going on in our culture that could possibly illustrate that the church wasn't having the impact that it could have had. And now he says, look, we always say God can use all things for good, right? Here we have a pandemic that's hitting us. And he says, this is an opportunity for the church to really be a light in the world, to show that, yes, even under these circumstances, here's a chance for us to thrive, I guess. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it was a great article and great story of we need to practice what we preach, and understanding that we're going to be refined through the flame, and we need to expect that. And here's a great time for us to step out and say, okay, do we believe what we believe? Are we going to practice what we preach? And through the difficulty of this time, do we have a foundation in Christ that's going to keep us solid and moving forward? Because this is, I believe, a great example of, if you have your foundation in gravel, you're going to get washed away right now, because it's not easy. And you can't just go get your simple church service on Sunday, and the kids get to go to Sunday school, and you get to go in and hear a message and maybe praise a little bit and see your buddies and go home. You're going to have to fight for it a little bit now. And I equate it a little bit to, I grew up in an environment where it was almost entirely Christians in my high school. It was a small high school in Western Virginia, a great school, don't get me wrong, wonderful, but we're all pretty much the same color, believe the same thing. Right. And when I went to college, which was not far away, I really had to decide, do I believe what I believe or not? Am I going to live it? There were trials there, and I had to step out and decide, and that was really rough. And that was really difficult for me. And I feel like, in general, the Christian community and our church here, we have to decide, do we believe what we believe? Are we going to put our money where our mouth is and step out? And, I just love the example that he gave of the early church. I think of the book of Acts. Like, that was not easy. They were persecuted along the way. They were fighting, and their faith was so strong. And just grew so deep. They talked about, here he says, God does not put us in a situation where we can't be deeply, deeply intimate with him. And I had the ability to just share a couple weeks ago the message, which was really wonderful, and to speak a little about the intimacy that God wants us to have with him. Like, he wants us to know him. And we're not going to make it through a time like a pandemic without a deep knowledge of Jesus. Yeah, it's too hard.
Yeah, and I when I look at the times that we're in, and one thing that I don't know, that I've seen over the last several months is even a lot of churches that acknowledge that we're in a, we got to do church differently, obviously, whether it be live streaming, things like that. A lot of the mentality has still been, all right, how do we do the same thing just in the way that we can do it now under these new circumstances? And I think that, this is an opportunity that God has really shaken things up so profoundly that we need to have a even different mindset than that. It's not just, how can we do the same thing? How can we hold the same worship service, but now we're just broadcasting it online? We need to think radically. What can we do differently? I mean, what can we really shake up to get out there in the world? And I've mentioned on the show before, and one of the things that I'm really thrilled with that we've started here, and this was Pastor Jay's idea when he first started working here, and my wife back there, being producer, was key in it. Ben was key in helping out with it, is the food truck ministry. When we, people are losing their jobs. A lot of people didn't even have money for gas. We had one person at our food pantry had to pay a taxi to come bring them here, and I thought that's just ridiculous. That they're having to pay someone to drive them here, and when they can't even afford to get their own food. And so we, just again, it's a matter of thinking outside the box. All right, the idea is not how do we get people to come to our food ministry, to come to us to get food in this new time. The idea is, how do we shake things up radically and completely? And the idea was, we rent a truck, we load it up, and we go into their neighborhoods. Yeah. And so that's what really struck me about this is that kind of thinking, that all the time we hear people talk about, we have to do things differently. So, but do you really appreciate the opportunity to do things, how much more differently things can do? The gospel doesn't change, but the way we can bring it to the world often has to.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree completely, Ken. And something that's also resonated with me is doing, as Reese says, a checkup from the neck up,
Yeah.
from where we are individually and as a congregation, because there are lots of excuses to not come to worship, or to not watch worship, or not be in community, or just not be connected like you were because it was part of your routine before and it was so easy. And it's not going to solve the problem if we make it easy in other ways now.
Right.
If the problem is growing deeper in our intimacy with Christ, that's an individual decision that we all have to make as Christians. And that's something that we've been talking about here for years, is how do we all take another step forward in our faith? Wherever we are now, how do we grow deeper and take another step? If it's your first moment of being a Christian, or if you've been a Christian for 80 years, how do you grow deeper? And that's just something that strikes me in this, is not what can we do, but what can I do?
Yeah.
What can I do to grow deeper? Because I'm not going to be able to function the same way that I was.
Yeah, because too many people, I think, look at the church as consumers. Like they're the consumer. And so what can the church do for me? Oh, we're in this new pandemic era. Okay, what can the church do now to reach out to me and to do X, Y, or Z, as opposed to looking into themselves and realizing that, their own obligation to think outside the box. And it gets into also something that, Jess and I talked about a little bit last week, and Ben the week before, is the distinction in worship, for example, between the deep underlying meaning and purpose of worship versus those surface elements of it.
That's that consumer. It's consumer. We're giving, they're taking, the congregation, but we got to remember what they need is Jesus intimately.
Right.
They don't need to sing a worship song if they're not singing it because they're passionate about worshiping Jesus. That's singing a song and it sounds nice, but that's not the purpose of the song. It's not the purpose of the message, purpose of reading the scripture. And we can go give food and not be a Christian organization.
Absolutely.
We can meet together and fellowship and have fun and not be a Christian organization if we're not trying to grow deeper in our relationships and as we grow deeper in Christ.
So I think it's a two-way street. You've got we've got to ask ourselves, how can we get to that underlying purpose? And from the church's perspective, it's how can the church, what can the church do to try to help people get there? And from the individual's perspective, it's what can I do in this new environment to help get there as well, so we can meet somewhere in the middle. Mary Kay, the comment on Facebook is from Jeanette, and it's about volume. I don't know if there's anything else we can do, or if anybody else is having difficulty hearing us. So if there's anything else you can do to boost it, I don't know.
Have to talk a little louder.
We can talk like this. Ryan and I can swallow our mics like this. How's this, Jeanette? Is this better? My wife's eardrums have just been burst.
Okay,
no,
I'm working on it.
She's working on it.
I'm trying to help her out.
One thing I'll say about Pastor Chan is, I think part of his point is we can't just go on like we've been going on. Like the wake-up call that we as a church and individuals have now of, oh, look, you got to do something different.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned even making connections with people, with your fellow members of the body. Well, if you're socially isolated or socially distanced, how do you go about doing that? Well, we have the church can put forth opportunities. All right, we can put forth Zoom Bible studies or outdoor gatherings or things like that. But at some point, that's kind of what the church as the entity can do. And at some point, it becomes your responsibility to partake in that and take advantage of that and ask yourself, okay, this isn't the way I'm always used to doing it. But what's more important, the way, me doing things the way I'm always used to and comfortable, or me making that connection? And this is, I think God uses opportunities like this to shake us up, to make us realize that the main thing is the main thing.
Yeah, I get convicted when I think of the early church. They weren't sitting around saying, guys, and ladies, we're used to doing it this way, and now we can't. So I'm not going to be able to do this anymore. That's not what was happening. I mean, they were fighting. They were, yeah.
So we have, speaking of somebody who I mentioned earlier in this program, we have a gentleman by the name of Jay Jackson has commented here on Facebook.
That's trouble.
Yeah, it is. The first comment was just, what? And then the second was, if you make disciples, church will happen. If you make church, disciples might happen. Well, we have to say amen because he's our boss. But other than that, no, but seriously, but that's the point, isn't it? It's just a different way of expressing it. But, I'm sorry, he says he's on vacation. Shh, we're not supposed to say. So it wasn't Jay Jackson. We'll just call him JJ.
JJ was on there.
JJ, anonymous. Yeah. You don't want people to know you shouldn't be posting in a public thing. Anyway, but it's a different way of saying the same thing. It's like if you're concerned with just those surface elements, you're not concerned with the relationship and the discipleship underneath, then you're not going to get that spiritual growth at all, and you're not going to get survivability, and your churches are going to die out, which is what we see happening.
And as we've talked about discipleship here, and how much you've talked about it on the show, discipleship can be a scary word because it carries with it vulnerability, and that's difficult between anyone. Between husband and wife, vulnerability is difficult. So between someone who is brother and sister in Christ, it's difficult. It's difficult between you and God because you're talking about sin in your life, and you're talking about growing and changing and not being how you are now and trying to be more like Christ, which you're never going to get there, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is the journey, and that's what discipleship is. It is becoming more Christ-like. And we can't put together a church service, a worship service, and expect everyone to be comfortable the whole time.
Right. And you mentioned something. I'll get a little philosophical here, and then we'll move on to the next story. But you mentioned the fact that the goal is to become like Christ, and we're never going to get there, but that's still the goal. And I look at that as that's a good thing, because we talk about, I've had conversations people before, as like, what's the meaning of life? And you can go to Douglas Adams and 42 and all that, but I'm not going to go there. That's actually life, the universe, and everything. That's actually something different. But think about the way our people that don't have God, that don't have Christ, operate in their lives. I've talked to a lot of people who don't believe in God that say, my life can still have purpose. And I say, no, your life doesn't have purpose. Your life has purposes, plural, because what happens is, you'll accomplish this. Like when I go out and I mowed my lawn the other day, my purpose was to make tall grass short. And I had that purpose, and I succeeded in that purpose. And then what? And then I was done. Then I had to go find something else to try to find purpose to what I'm doing. All right. Whereas if my fundamental driving purpose in life is to become more and more like Christ, first of all, it can still be rewarding because I can look back on myself a year ago and hopefully I can see growth. So I can see that, yes, I am, the Holy Spirit is working in me. This is a good thing. So it's not a meaningless pursuit. And yet it's always going to be there throughout your entire life because you're never going to be perfect. You're never going to achieve everything. You're completely being like Christ. Yeah. Your life has meaning.
Yeah, and it will have joy if that's your pursuit. It will, because he promises us that it will.
That's as deeply philosophical as I'm going to get today.
Love it.
So, all right, one more story to go, Ryan. This one's on you.
Yikes.
Go for it.
Okay, and we pivot back to the beginning. Okay, Pew Research, 46% of U.S. evangelicals okay with premarital sex in a committed relationship. That's the headline. I know maybe I'm not supposed to just read headlines, but
because there's a lot of other findings in there too.
But there are, but that's a big headline. 46% of U.S. evangelicals are okay with premarital sex in a committed relationship. There are lots of other different statistics that are in here that talk about age, older people who were polled rather than younger, as well as those who were different types of Christians, where it was you were Catholic, or you were, what are the other ones, Protestant or evangelical. I think those are the three that they have. But the question remains the same. Is premarital sex okay in a committed relationship? So outside of marriage.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is, and it's funny, you're right. And the key word there is evangelicals, because if you were to take the various different categories of Christianity that these studies usually break things down into, the evangelical category is, shall we say, the most conservative, and so, and predictably, the results of this poll follow that, right? It still is, but that tells you if your baseline is 46%. Right. Basically half of evangelicals say this is okay. That tells you where the other numbers are going.
Can you go out? can you just describe what denominations fit in each?
Well, the categories it mentioned here, it says, and this is just what was mentioned in the article, 46% of evangelical Protestants said that sex in a committed relationship is sometimes or always acceptable, compared to 57% of Protestants in the historically black tradition, 64% of Catholics, and 67% of mainline Protestants. I always find it interesting where Trinity would fall under their categories. Are we considered mainline Protestant? But we evangelicals in our name, so I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think we're the exception to some of these rules. But it's, but yeah, that's kind of how they classify it here. And now, one other thing to be fair is that for the most part across the board, when you were comparing Christians to non-Christians, or that it was a stark contrast.
Yes.
That obviously the non-Christians as a group were far more willing to permit a lot of things than the Christians as a group were. But this one finding, you're right, does stand out pretty dramatically, and I think it goes back to some of what we touched on in the first story tonight. And this is now the culture, what we're seeing in the cultural movement. And this is not an attempt to throw stones at anybody. We've all sinned. We get that. Paul's pretty clear on that. Yeah. Okay, and so that's not the point of this conversation. The point is, and the study actually did say that. So the survey did not ask respondents to answer based on what they personally would do, but on what they believe, irrespective of their own choices. So irrespective of whether we've sinned or not. All right. Yeah. The question is, what do you think should be done? What's the goal? What are we supposed to achieve? And 46% of evangelical Protestants said they're okay with the goal being you can have premarital sex even outside of marriage, as long as you're in a committed relationship. And one thing that I've expressed to my children, and the way I kind of look at it is, the Bible obviously talks about us being two being one flesh, and the intercourse is like a physical representation of that, obviously. Excuse me, my water went down my windpipe. But it is the most intimate physical representation you can have of that union. And so I get it. You're saying, well, they're in a committed relationship. Well, define a committed relationship, because marriage is supposed to be like the most committed relationship you can have. It's, till death do us part. And so if you take the most intimate physical expression that you can have, and you allow that to enter the relationship somewhere below the most spiritual commitment you can make, then what do you have left to physically express that highest level of spiritual commitment you can make to someone? You don't. You've already given it away down here, if that makes sense. And Mary Kay, I know you said there's a comment on YouTube. It's not popping up for me for some reason. I don't see it here.
There's a man named Nick Gertz.
Mm-hmm.
No, Gerz. Gerz. He's asking if he can call in.
That, you know what, Nick, I would love that were the case. That would be fantastic. But no, we don't have that capability yet to do a call in on it. You can use the live chat there in YouTube if you want to ask a question. Or, Nick, may I make a suggestion? If your concern is that you feel that you've got more to say than that YouTube's going to allow, because I know there are character limitations, if you hop over to Facebook and Google, look for Trinity Joppa on Facebook. We're also live on Facebook, and Facebook allows a little bit more in terms of comments than YouTube does. So to the extent that helps you out, you can hop over there and you can include a longer comment on Facebook, and we'll see it there too, and we can answer you on the air. So anyway, those are my thoughts. What about you, Ryan?
Yeah, Ken, it's hard. When I think about this and the commitment aspect of it that you just talked about, the word that comes to my mind is covenant. Mm-hmm. The covenant relationship that is in a marriage between man, woman, and God. And that's something that, we believe that God has created, something that he has said this is good and it is supposed to look this way. And to be honest, I don't understand all the reasons why that is. There's a little mystery there of, why does God make marriage look this way? But in the end, there is a covenant there, and he says this is supposed to be, like you said, reserved for marriage where there's a covenant above a commitment. It's beyond. I mean, that's the intention. Is it is a covenant which cannot be broken. Therefore, it is a safe place, and the intimacy that you experience then in a marriage is something that you can fully give to your partner, and there is no danger of that relationship then ending, ideally, in a covenant relationship as you move forward. So I feel like lost the sacredness of the covenant. That's not really a word that we even use. Commitment can mean the same thing. And we make lots of commitments in our life about a lot of different things, and we break a lot of commitments.
Yeah, and I don't know why, but on my phone I can now see it. I don't know why I'm not getting the YouTube comments here on the computer, but and Nick, I do see you have a follow-up comment here. You said commenting questions is a sin. I'm not sure I understand your point, if you're saying that you commenting with a question, us answering it is a sin, or I don't want to guess. I don't want to guess. So I'm happy to respond if you have the ability to flesh that out a little bit more. I can see it now on my phone. So yeah, and I guess here's what I come to, and there's as an apologist, I'm always kind of looking to kind of find common ground with people that we can build upon, and to me there's so many different approaches you could take when it comes to the premarital sex question and the propriety of it. Obviously, as a Christian, it hits at exactly what you're talking about. I mean, this is, if you are devoted to God, then God has set forth this covenant relationship, and He said that's where it belongs. And so understand that if you try to say, well, I know better, essentially, you're saying you know better than God. And is that something that is really consistent with God being your Lord, Jesus being your Lord and Savior? And then even if I'm speaking to someone on a secular level, I mean, there's all sorts of different directions. I mean, you could talk about, whether diseases and risks and things that have come about as a result of this. And what that says for me as a Christian is, every now and then, God doesn't just say, do what I say. It's like, look what happens when we don't do what He says. There are consequences.
Right.
And should we really be surprised by that, so to speak?
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's where I get back to, is like, even if you don't, if you are, if I got somebody who's coming to me from a purely secular standpoint, so I'm not a Christian, I haven't accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior. Why do I care what God has to say in the Bible about it? I'll say, okay, well, that's a conversation we should definitely have about that. But what about these consequences we've seen come up in a society as a result of the liberal? I hate to use liberalization because that has political undertones, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then get back to, just from a purely logical standpoint, is like, well, if you are willing to engage in that intercourse, that intimate act with any number of partners, just because you think you're committed to one another, what do you have left when you do get married? I mean, what do you have left to physically express to that person? And so I do think that our goal, don't do math. All right, my wife doesn't have a 60-minute sign, and so now she's holding up a 45 and 15, expecting us to add them up to know that we've been on the air for 60 minutes now.
Yeah.
So I knew she was going to do that. So anyway, all right. Anything else on that one? Have we?
Yeah, there's mystery there, but I go back to, God knows what's best for us, and we can make choices that we think are best for us, but ultimately, do we trust that He knows best or not?
Right.
That's what it boils down to me on so many fronts, especially with this topic. Is, you can ask so many why questions. Well, why are there enjoyable things in this world that we're not supposed to experience all the time, like the intimacy that we're talking about right now? Well, because God says so.
Right.
I know it's not that simple, and that doesn't just bring clarity to everybody, but there is an aspect of trust and faith that goes into it, and then of talking to someone maybe who is married to say, look, it is a beautiful and wonderful thing when it's in marriage. And
But it amazes me, though, that people, by and large, realize that when it's in other contexts. In other words, very few people are going to recommend a completely hedonistic lifestyle where people should, we all recognize that there are limits. You can't just go out and engage in whatever pleasure you want to, whenever you want to do it. And God is not a cosmic party pooper. He does put good things into our life. He does put enjoyable things into our lives, but he puts limits on them and says, okay, but here's the confines within which you should enjoy this. And again, that as a basic principle is something that we certainly recognize in other contexts. Where it becomes a problem is when it's something that we want to do.
Yeah, it's the whole, this, I did not come up with this, but you've heard this before. The sheep's inside the fence, and they say, well, why can't I get out of the fence? I want to go out there. There's so many fun things that I can do. But then, the farmer says, you're inside the fence so the wolves don't eat you.
Right.
Like, if I let you out, that's what would happen. This is why we have boundaries. Just like you have boundaries for a child, that's why so many times in the Bible we talk about father-son relationships and God our Father. And there's reasons that we can identify with that. I have a 5-year-old son. He has a lot of boundaries he does not understand. And then when he breaks them, sometimes he realizes, oh, that wasn't very smart because I just fell off my bike and I shouldn't have jumped off the curve on my bike when I'm not very good at riding my bike, and then I hit a car that's our neighbor's car. I mean, stuff like that,
Hypothetically.
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 No, I wish that.
There's a reason you can't have those Pop-Tarts for breakfast every morning.
There you go.
You're talking to a guy who has bacon for breakfast far more than he should. Now, I wish my dog was watching right now and could speak English and understand these things. With the sheep example, we got a dog that she's figured that she can jump the fence. Yeah, and she's always escaping the backyard. She has to be on one of these trolley leashes every time she's out there, and she's still managed to find various ways to get out of her harness and off of her trolley leash sometimes. But I mean, it's just amazing. But we have a community of foxes that's actually moved into our neighborhood. Now, I don't think a fox would ever attack her because she's a pretty big dog. But still, it's the same thing you're saying. So there's dangers on that side of the fence. Dog, stay on this. You may not like that I'm putting you on this leash, but this is why, because you're too dumb not to jump the fence if I don't.
Yeah, and we say to our 5-year-old, do you trust us? Do you trust us? Yeah. And that's a hard question even for a 5-year-old to answer sometimes. Yes, I do, or sometimes I'm not so sure. Yeah.
So maybe we should have started out this episode with a warning about sensitive content being discussed or something like that.
Explicit warning on the
bottom. But this is not. If you hadn't figured out by now, if you're watching Trinity Talk Live and thinking this is a show to gather the kids around the TV, then you haven't been watching very long, because we don't shy away from stuff like this. Hopefully, we handled the topics today reasonably, respectfully. But again, as Christians, there's a perception sometimes that Christians, are afraid to talk about things like this, just hush, 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 and that can't be
that we're going to talk about it in a way of we've got it all figured out and we don't struggle with anything, that we're above and beyond. It's to be clear, I'm a sinful person. I don't have all this understood. I don't get everything right all the time. We're trying to go at it from a foundation in Christ. Right. And that's where I'm trying to go for my answers. And sometimes I don't understand them all, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to go there seeking those answers.
And that's my prayer that people get out of the show as you watch it is, you may not agree with us at the end of the day. You may think we've gotten it completely wrong, but hopefully, if more than anything else, what we try to exemplify is exactly that we're trying to go to Christ for our answers to these questions and talk them out. And it doesn't matter how tough the issues are, it doesn't matter how controversial the issues are, we should be able to do that, to go to Christ for the answers and have a meaningful and productive conversation about it, to try to work together to uncover the truth. So, all right, are we good? All right, I don't see any other comments popping up on either outlet, so I'm going to sign off, and then what will probably happen is somebody will comment right after we go off the air because we're a 30-second delay, but that has happened before, and I apologize for that. But hey, thank you very much for watching us here this evening. Thank you, Ryan, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
This was our McAllister segment, 2 weeks in a row, and you can tell Jess that I said you're both varsity. Okay?
No, I was going to say, you all had to struggle through me tonight. Sorry about that.
So, and thank you very much. Yet again, second week in a row, we have had Lisa Koger back there assisting. I don't know how much she was doing, how many buttons you were letting her push back there, or that she was willing to push. But Lisa Koger was back there helping with our live stream, along with my wife, Mary Kay, who's our producer. So thank you very much for everybody. And please make sure to join us again. We will be back again next week. Wednesdays at 5:30 are our new time slot. Next week, Ben is going to be back. At least he's supposed to be. He hasn't told me otherwise. So Ben, if you're watching, you better be back next week, because I've just announced it. So, all right. Thank you all again. See you next week. God bless.